Hey everybody, it's Carm here. I'm coming to you in a lovely early morning. Wanted to come on and do a video I've been wanting to do really since the beginning. I first started making videos. Over the years I've mentioned quite a bit at one time or another about the radio program Musical Starstreams. How important it's been in sort of my own early musical education, and been wanting to do a video just on the show, talking a little bit about the show itself and my personal history with it. And my initial plan was I wanted to come on and just show everything. So I bought many albums over the course of now 30 years from hearing the show, and introduced to a lot of artists directly from the show. I concluded that would take way too long, and that would be that's a lot of albums as I'm coming across them. So I figured a better way to approach it would be to make it kind of an ongoing series, kind of like the 3 on a Thursday series, where I'm just showing 3 albums per video, make it a little more concise. So finally starting in with that. It's been an incredibly important show for me personally for all these years. Really kind of like the first school of music, I think, for me. Introduced me to so much, and so much kind of branched out from there as far as not just musical interests, but open to all forms of art and expression. And just the way it's so evocative, and the way it just ties in with kind of fires the imagination. The show has always just done that for me. So I sometimes think I wouldn't even be sitting here doing videos if it weren't for the show. I mean, it was that important. So I'll start in with a little bit about the show itself. Scratched out a few notes just to try to keep a sense of coherency, hopefully. But the show originated in the Bay Area, San Francisco, in 1981 on a station called KTIM out of San Rafael, by a fellow named Frank Forrest, who later came to be known as Just Forrest. Sometimes literally Just Forrest would be his moniker, but at the time he was Frank Forrest. He's originally from Michigan. He was in radio from college onwards. At one time he studied law to become a lawyer, passed the bar exam, but music kept pulling at him, and decided this is where his heart was at. I'm personally all the better for that decision. But it was in December of 1981 where the first show came on the air. At that time it was actually titled Music for Your Inner Space. And the second show was in April of 1982. And that's when he settled on the name Musical Starstreams. And the format at the time was, the contemporary instrumental, new age, keyboard-based, a mixture of that, a little bit of experimental, classical. There was actually those earliest shows, he was approaching it quite cautiously, playing sort of the more outre areas of more familiar music, like the Beatles and Pink Floyd, Simon and Garfunkel. Even some classical soundtracks like 2001. So a way to kind of ease into the more esoteric sort of thing that he was later getting into. And throughout the decade and into the 90s, he kind of had that similar format of, combination of keyboard-based instrumental, both electronic and acoustic, as well as ethnic music from around the world. As the 90s wore on, it got more into what he had dubbed as exotic electronica, or ambient dub, kind of a slower, hazier variant of techno, I would say, which I'll be honest, when I first heard it, I wasn't all that receptive to it, and I wished he would have kind of stuck with the older format, which I was introduced to. But as I eventually kind of caught up and began to appreciate that stuff a lot more, even though the earlier eclectic stuff was always where my own heart was at. But the show still runs to this day. It's just on the internet for the most part. If there are any terrestrial affiliates, I don't think there's very many left. But through the years, he would be broadcast on both public as well as commercial radio, and that's where I first heard it on commercial radio. And yeah, so my own introduction to the show was through a station called WNUA 95.5, which I had mentioned, which was our it was called a smooth jazz station. It aired here in Chicagoland from 1987 to 2009. And I first heard it at my aunt's house. It was one of the spring holidays in 1988, either Easter or Mother's Day. I was 12 years old, a sixth grader, and at that time I think the station I was listening to was called WGCI. I forget the exact call. It might have been 107 point something or 105 point something, far right of the station, and it was mostly soul and R&B, kind of an adult contemporary R&B. Not exactly aimed at my age group either at the time, but that was actually turned out to be a pretty good segue into hearing WNUA. But I was asking her, what is this? Music is really interesting, and it was primarily instrumental. I'd say it went a lot further beyond what could be called smooth jazz. It was all kinds of instrumental. It was sometimes straight ahead jazz. Other times, it was a pretty eclectic mix. I think during the day they would play stuff that was more like for people at the office, stuff that was more, kind of steady state, or maybe even kind of Muzak-like in a way. But as the evening wore on, I think it's when it got more interesting. And so I became an avid fan of the station. I tuned in. I usually liked at least every couple, 2 or 3 pieces, every other, few pieces that played. But then it was when I was in 8th grade, and it was either the last Sunday of 1989 or the first of 1990. It was during Christmas break in 8th grade, where I was flipping through the radio and came on WNUA, and I heard this incredible sound, which I had never heard before, and it was so powerful and otherworldly. Clearly a synthesizer. This kind of droning, shimmering, both bright and dark sound, which was just, for me, it was galvanizing. Didn't know what this was. Didn't have any. It was just on radio. I didn't have a tape recorder or anything to document it. But eventually found out it was this show called Musical Starstreams, and I guess it had been broadcast on there for a while. If I didn't mention before, the show had always been on Sundays. Originally it was 4 to 6, back in the Bay Area. Well, this time it was on WNUA. It was on from 10 to midnight on Sundays, and would be for quite a few years. But that was my introduction to the show. I remember that particular evening. I'm sitting on my bed, and I'm reading one of those, Joe Weider muscle magazines. Apparently, at the time, I wanted to be a Joe Weider muscle man for a while. I don't know, but I remember looking at this this advertisement of somebody, lifting the weights, and they had this. It was either like a triangle, like a pyramid, or a diamond on their forehead, like the third eye, with these rays coming out of it. Just some kind of advertisement for, whatever product. But I remember that picture, and the music that was playing was perfectly merged. And I remember just poring over this picture while this was playing, and that's something that always stuck with me. Again, that kind of evocativeness of the show, and so much of the music that was played. And so from there on out, I became an instant fan of the show and tuned in every Sunday. And it wasn't until right after getting out of 8th grade, I had mentioned Neil before, from talking about Genesis Live and all of that, and so much that he introduced me to. It turns out he liked the show too when we first talked about it. Well, he had gifted me a boombox for my 8th grade graduation. I had a tape recorder and everything, and shortwave radio and graphic EQ. It was a really nice boombox, and that's when I started taping the show in almost to the day, June of 1990, either the first or second Sunday of the month. And yeah, that's really where it started. During that time when I got into the show, the way it was set up, the way the sets ran, again, it was a 2-hour show. It would start in with an intro, kind of a musical intro, and you'd say, "This is Musical Starstreams," and then it would play. It would go on for maybe 20 to 25 minutes. He would just play several. Frank Forrest would play several songs from various albums, and then when the set would end and go to commercial, he'd come on and announce, welcome you into the show, and then he would announce what you had just heard in reverse order, from what you just heard to the beginning. It would go to commercial, then you'd have the second set, in which he would announce what the featured album would be. And every show had a featured album where he would play 2 songs from it, something that was a new release. So he'd play one song then and one song later in the show. So that set would play, that featured album song, and then a few other from various other albums. Then you go to commercial, and then you go to the third set. It would be kind of like a repeat of the first set, where at the end he would announce in reverse order what you heard. Then the fourth set would start, after the commercial, and then he would feature the second song from the featured album and play it like the previous ones. And then for the final set, after the commercial, he would come on and tell you everything you're about to hear, and then the show would close out like that with just the music. Now, when I was taping the show, it was with 90-minute cassettes, 2-hour show, but even with cutting out the commercials, which I usually did, it still wasn't quite long enough to get all the music onto the tape. So I got most of it on, but sometimes I had to make sure I at least got the tape to flip the tape over to record it. Sometimes I'd fall asleep beforehand and I wouldn't get the whole show. And sometimes the commercials would get in there too, which of course adds to the charm of it, because you're hearing something from that time. But yeah, that's really where it started for me with the show, and went on for years. Throughout high school, I continued to tape the show, and it was kind of on and off the radio at various points. Later in the 90s, again with that newer format that it was getting into, that different kind of electronic. I probably wasn't quite as avidly a listener as I had been previously, and I think it was on the station for the final time around 2008 or so. I think I have a tape of that too. And then WNUA went off the air, or changed after that. But I still have the tapes, a lot of the tapes, which I converted to CD, and still listen now, and still find albums that were featured on the show, even now. So yeah, it's just a little basic, long drawn out information about the show and my history with it. But yeah, I'll share 3 albums that I discovered through the show, and in most of the cases, I was learning of these artists for the first time from hearing it on the show, and I wasn't sure how I was going to approach it. If I was going to try to go by the earliest that I heard. It's really good. For the most part, it'll be a random assortment of albums, kind of like the Thursday videos. Now, this first one, though, is I had heard directly from the very first show that I taped off the radio, and one of the very few albums I've ever had, which I would call a grail. And aside from my Zug album by Conrad Schnitzler, the picture disc album, it's probably my most shown album. Album I've showed the most in my videos over the years. Takashi Kokobo, Volkan Bauhaus, a Japanese electronic musician. Something I was after since hearing it on the show, back in June of 1990. Featured just one of the songs from it, and I was so intrigued by it. I said I always kept that in mind, that I have to find that one of these days. And I think 24 years later, 2014, finally found a copy fairly reasonable. It's on from 1985 on Tranquility. Now I remember when Frank Forrest had was talking about this album, had mentioned it, you know, in the show. He'd referred to it as being a very rare Japanese import, and it was only 5 years old at the time. So, you know, even then it was, you know, kind of rare and hard to come by. She would feature a lot of, you know, a lot of that sort of thing. But yeah, when I heard that piece, I said, you know, I have to find this one of these days. And on here, it's you know, electronic. It's primarily Fairlight CMI, PPG Wave 2.3, Yamaha DX7. There's the fellow himself. Stuff in general is fairly hard to find. You know, you get it mostly from Japan. Now the piece that I had heard on here was called Before Your Dream. That was the piece that was featured. Now, if you know the Fairlight instrument, you know, it's very heavily featured here. You know, the sound of almost sounds like the, you know, water going through tubes. It's very acoustic, you know, very acoustic, electroacoustic sounding. In some ways, kind of like traditional. You know, you could hear maybe like Berlin School from an alternate universe, you know, mixed with his own style. Very minimal, repetitive, more hypnotic than tedious, I find. Manages to sound very organic for the time it was, you know, came out, you know, in the mid '80s. But that piece, especially Before Your Dream, you know, has this kind of very interesting, kind of fluttering, nocturnal feel, like you're just floating through this, like almost like this dense gallery, you know, almost like a, again, talking about like an alternate universe, like an art gallery in an alternate universe. You're just kind of hovering through it and seeing, you know, could be paintings and sculptures on either side and coming up ahead of you that you're just going through very slowly. You know, and again, they're kind of just illuminated, you know, just shadows all around them, but you know, they're very, you know, still much illuminated. You can still see the detail in them. That's what the piece always struck me as. You're just kind of slowly going through this gallery. But there's such an, again, amazing mix of, you know, the organic and electronic. You know, the way he was able to merge it. Some of the later pieces, you know, have more of an experimental electroacoustic feel, a little more abstract, and kind of an almost kind of an industrial machine-like quality. But again, you're kind of going through, you know, this kind of dense vegetation as well. Somehow they're mixed and fused in a way that, you know, doesn't sound like they're opposing each other, but it really goes together beautifully. I've heard a little bit of his other work online, and it's, you know, along a similar vein. Actually does quite a wide variety of music. Some more towards the meditative and you know, healing arts, but this kind of fits in there nicely, you know, between the experimental and the more you know, calming and restorative. But just yeah, it was an album that I was after for such a long time, and it was well worth it. Yeah, it says this recording used no keyboard players, no multi-track tape recording techniques, no analog sounds. But I think everything is from, you know, somehow the way he programmed the synthesizers. So it's a different approach he had taken here, you know, than you might have normally otherwise heard. But yeah, very much recommended. Actually, not long after I found this album, after looking for so long and finding it for, you know, pretty reasonable, it was uploaded in full. I think there's 2 versions on YouTube. You could hear this album in its entirety. So yeah, from the very first show I taped, yeah, Volk von Bauhaus, Takashi Kokobo. It was very rare at the time, and yeah, it's still pretty rare. So yeah. Next up, an old favorite and really became kind of a classic on the show during the time I was listening to it. And it was also a featured album, on for the show. Water Station by Tim Clement. Ties in with the last video I did showing Summerland by Tim Clement and Michael Dana, what they had done a few years before. And actually, I think Michael Dana co-wrote one of the pieces here. French-Canadian multi-instrumentalist. Keyboards and guitars. And it featured a couple of cuts from this album. Yeah, the first piece is called Water Breaking, Light Dancing. Talk about intriguing titles for songs and albums. You have pedal steel guitar by Kim Deschamps, who is mentioned here as being part of Cowboy Junkies, which I hadn't realized before. Something kind of a bridge to something, a group that's more familiar. But that piece really fits the title. It's very kind of abstract. You do imagine that, with light, sunlight, kind of sparkling on the water. But again, there's the kind of, sort of dark, mysterioso ambiguity to it. Not much melody. It's just kind of a, more of like a tone poem, but just very, a little more abstract. Mahi's Outlook also has the pedal steel guitar, and that goes into a little more of a familiar sound, more of an open landscape. Really beautiful minimal keyboard, somewhat impressionistic, but also kind of pulling back, not overtly melodic, but just kind of hinting at that. Very kind of slow, hazy rhythm, but that ethereal in a way, but that steel guitar kind of brings it a little more down to earth, a little more familiar. Can't pronounce this. La Danse de Serpent Blanc, one of the longer pieces. You have Stefan Mikas guesting on here, if you're familiar with him. Incredible multi-instrumentalist from Germany, making what sounds like a fairly rare guest appearance. I don't think he played on very many other albums, aside from his own. Plays the Egyptian reed flute. Very much his own approach. Very interesting hearing him with instrumentation that he himself wouldn't normally play. Synthesizers and some bass, fretless bass. So that's a really real nice treat with that. And then you come upon Urantia, which is one of the pieces that Starstreams had featured in that show. We have Highland pipes being played by Patrick O'Gorman, and some vocal and extra computer programming. But the Highland pipes really have a interesting sound, or kind of like bagpipes. Again, kind of bringing that more ethereal quality that the music has, bringing a little bit more to earth. That has a very kind of long, kind of expansive land quality, like a meadow or like a hill that you're seeing, very far in the distance, and just kind of, traveling slowly through it. Now the next piece, Beautiful Lady, was probably, out of all the pieces that were played on the show over the years, it was one of the big staples that you heard all the time. I couldn't tell you how many shows I had heard that piece on. Now this piece is co-composed by Michael Dana, and it has almost kind of a Balinese gamelan feel to it. Sounds like it was influenced and inspired by that, as well as little odd bits of percussion here and there. Very, very neat, very, again, kind of earthy and exotic. But what's really interesting is there's a recording of a medium or a psychic, spoken word, kind of interspersed with the music, and he kind of sounds like a something out of one of the old pulp fiction novels, or Dashiell Hammett or something like that, like an old gumshoe, with a bit of a dialect, but he's actually talking about it sounds like a metaphysical story he's relating or had experienced, with somebody who died, left their body behind, but they're kind of the form that their spirit was taking, and this kind of scenario they're living through. That when we die, we leave our body behind. That's just our vehicle, but we still live on in some form. Sounds like what he's saying. But it's interesting though that it's being these deeper issues or more ethereal scenario, as it were, is being delivered in this kind of old gumshoe voice. Just kind of, it's very interesting having that blend along with the music itself, which is, again, it has that kind of Balinese gamelan feel. It's a very interesting piece. A beautiful lady, and again became kind of a staple of the show. And then you have music for the Meridian Figure Dance Commission, which is another one of those, slowly unfolding pieces, really kind of out of the mist. The sounds of water, tides lapping up on the shore, which gets, kind of builds to a greater and greater crescendo. Really kind of a very celebratory piece. And interesting, that it was a dance commission. Try to imagine the way they would dance to it. It wouldn't be probably in the usual way. But very, the album overall is really a fascinating blend of styles and instrumentation. And again, for the most part, it's music that's very, kind of like with Summerland, it's very patient music that unfolds gradually. So Tim Clement, he himself doesn't have a real large discography, I don't think. Probably a little better known for his collaborations with Michael Dana, but this is a real a standout, with everything else. So yeah, Tim Clement, Water Station, another old staple of the show. And finally here, probably might be the most well-known album, one of the most well-known albums I'll show in this whole series. New Age of Earth by Ashra, Emmanuel Gotching, pictured here with Rosie Mueller, who's his partner at the time, from 1976, Splax. Got this back in the mid-90s. The piece I had heard from the show, which was some years before getting into the group and getting into the artist himself, was Ocean of Tenderness. And that became, a staple of, heard quite often on the show at least at that time. Well, probably throughout the 80s, I would guess too. I'd heard it around 90 or 91. Though I didn't get into the earlier iteration of the group, Ashra Temple, until maybe 95 or 96. And it was a while after that before I made the connection. Around this time he was going solo under the name Ashra, where it was just Manuel playing guitars and synthesizers. And of course, I'm sure many of you know this album, and needs very little introduction. It's definitely among more well-known of his, and I guess when one talks about the Berlin School, it still has its, sequencer-based, but still very much its own approach. Even distinct from Klaus Schulze and Tangerine Dream, what they were doing. But Sun Rain coming in, you have electronic percussion. Very upbeat, kind of a burbling, bubbling sound. Just kind of really traveling through space, but very, it's a very kind of a cheery sound, very much, hopeful and optimistic. We're coming across completely new territory. Not quite dark and mysterioso, but it's like a very, happy kind of beckoning introduction. But then you get in this Ocean of Tenderness, which, from the first time I had heard it, was just, again, powerful, but in such a beckoning way. Mostly these kind of synthesizer washes, and eventually the electric guitar comes in, adding a slight bluesy effect. Again, kind of merging the earthy and the ethereal. Just absolutely gorgeous. A perfect title for this piece. Again, very very welcoming, very beckoning, but also you feel like you're bathing in it. You do feel like you're on the water and just kind of swaying along, and you're taken to a new territory. But it's okay. It's okay to go there. and you feel it's very therapeutic the whole time. Just beautiful. Deep Distances, kind of like the first piece. You're traveling further on to the journey, but you're on to more. You're kind of taking a turn, but it's a little more upbeat. Again, with the electronic percussion and synthesizer. And Night Dust is similar to Ocean of Tenderness, but more overtly spacey. Starting off very slowly and gradually, and just kind of slowly lifting you up, and eventually it gets a little more upbeat as it goes, but it's more of hinting at that of an acceleration, but still kind of still taking you up higher and higher as you go. But just absolutely gorgeous. An example of electronic music of the time, which is still very very warm, breathing, and human, not mechanical at all. I don't feel. And again, hearing this song and hearing some of this album way back when, long before I learned of the group, was really nice. The way it opened things up, and kind of pointed to what was ahead, long before I'd heard them. So, yeah, if you're not familiar with this one, it's very much recommended. And New Age of Earth by Ashra, or later known as just Ashra, still going under Ashra Temple here. Emmanuel Goching, guitars and synthesizers. And yeah. So these are just a few of many albums I'll hope to be eventually showing. Again, introductions to all these artists, over the years, and look forward to talking a little bit more about, or quite a lot more about this early school of music. And I'll leave some links in the notes for. I think there's some early episodes of the show on YouTube still, and also on the website. If you go to the playlist section, it's embedded in there. You could also find the very first show that was ever broadcast. You could listen to it in its entirety. I think it's the section. Just go into the playlist section. It's kind of embedded in there, and you could hear it and read up on the show itself. If you're interested, looking further into it. So thank you all. I don't know how long this has gone on. Probably, it's gone on for quite a while. But the next videos, they'll definitely be shorter. But I just really wanted to talk about the show and what it's meant to me, and it'll probably, it'll have that meaning really throughout life, because it's really where it started. So thank you all. I hope you're all well, and to the next one. Peace, love, and joy.